Hi everybody, my name's Julie, I'm an addict. Hey. Welcome to the Sunday speaker meeting. I'm going to read the 11th tradition. Our public relations policy is based on attraction rather than promotion. We need always maintain personal anonymity at the level of press, radio, and films. If anyone here represents a media agency, please contact Julie C.
Hi everybody, my name is Jamose, I'm an addict. I'd like to say thank you to the convention committee for inviting us here. This has been really great, and unfortunately I came down with a little bug when I got here, so I've got this chloroseptic spray. Don't be alarmed if you see me spritzing myself. And it was funny because a couple hours ago Kermit came to the area we're staying in, and I said, "Honey, I need to go to the doctor. I'm doing worse." And he said, "What's wrong?" And I said, "My tongue's turning green." And he said, "Let me see." And he looked at it and he said, "There's nothing wrong with you. You've been spritzing chloroseptic spray in your mouth." And I thought, "Oh yeah." And I just thought, how can I be so dumb, you know? It's like, even with a few 24 hours, we make big mistakes and judgments sometimes. I can imagine the look on the doctor's face if I'd come in because my tongue was green. Anyway, I guess I'll talk a little bit about how I got here and what my life is like today. A moment of silence for me. I was born in '59. My dad was an Air Force guy. We moved around the first few years of my life, and the first few years I have bits and pieces of memories, and I remember them being really great. We were in Germany the first few years, and my parents were young enough that they enjoyed going to different countries and doing stuff on the weekends, and so I was into going to the zoo, so we hit all the good zoos in Europe. So, for a little kid, that was a lot of fun stuff. And we moved back to the States, and things kind of went downhill right away. My half-brother left, and I had a feeling something was bad wrong, because when he left, he said that he was going to be gone for 2 weeks, and then he would come back. But the way my mother was crying, I had a feeling he was fibbing to us. And I was right. He went to California. He wanted to know his real father, and he never came back. And I didn't see him for years. And right behind that, my mother had a schizophrenic breakdown and was hospitalized for about a year. And my father hadn't even known that she was schizophrenic. She had not had any sort of episodes since she was in her early 20s, and I guess she thought that was a part of her past and hadn't mentioned it to him, so he was in for a real surprise, because she was pretty much out of our lives for about a year. And I remember looking for solutions outside myself that year. I know one of the first things that I did to alter my mood was, I think I got a couple of Kennedy $50 or a silver dollar, but I remember it was a real big coin in my hand, and I went to the 7-Eleven and I bought an icy, and I got a lot of change back, and I sat on the curb and I drank my icy, and then I went back in and got another icy, and I got some more candy. And you would think, being a little guy about 4 years old, I would have given up on that pretty soon. But I waited until I went back in thinking my money would last forever, because a dollar went a lot farther in 1963. And the guy said, "You don't have enough money for another icy." And I was really let down. And I remember thinking, God, it was really going good for a while there. Now it's all over, and I was sitting on the curb feeling sort of dejected. And I don't even know why I was out without adult supervision blocks from my home, but let's just say my dad believed in freedom, And he let me have a lot of freedom as a child. And it was a safer world back then too. But one of the neighbors came along and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I've been drinking ices and now I'm out of money." And he said, "Get in the car, I'm taking you home." And so I got in the car because I knew he was one of the neighbors that my dad liked. He was, right across the street. And trying to bond with the neighbors became something else that I tried to do. That year, I think that my family had sort of disintegrated, and I was looking for some security in the world, and it seemed as though the ethnic families were a little warmer to me, and I gravitated toward them. We had a French family, an Italian family, and an Oriental family on the street, and I liked being in their homes. I felt more welcome in their home, and I think I was looking for some security in the world, and I've learned in the past few years especially that security in this world is a really elusive thing, and that's why we have to seek God. But that was my little 4-year-old attempt at security. And the funny thing is, I kept that pattern up until I was 30 years old. I was doing some step work and was wondering, because I was still seeking out family situations with ethnic families at age 30, and I didn't know why, and so I was doing a little step work and trying to figure out what that was about, because it felt compulsive, it felt unhealthy, and I wondered what it was about. And I knew in the back of my mind I was saying, you'll be safe if these people tell you that you're a part of the family, and I realized that was that for little 4-year-old kids still running me, and I was able to learn to enjoy my relationships and not become so attached to them behind that, because I realized what the motivation was and where that was coming from. We moved around a couple more times before the 2nd grade, and then we settled in Montgomery, Alabama. The next door neighbors were a Greek family, so I was right at home, and I sort of adopted into the Greek family. And it was neat because there was a little boy that was a year younger than me and one that was a year older than I was, and they were just really two very special, loving little boys, and they just accepted me right away. And there weren't any girls on the street, so we played sort of sports, baseball and football, and kill the man with the ball and that kind of stuff. And we kept up with our batting averages the 2nd year I was there, and I batted .500. And when we figured them up at the end of the summer, and George, the older boy, announced that I had batted .500, he said, "And Jamese, you also got the most runs batted in." And he was a real dramatic sort of little kid. He said, "Jamese is like Babe Ruth's little sister." And then later that day he said, "And you know what, Jamese, you're my little Greek sister too." And my heart soared, because that was the one thing that my mom and dad couldn't give me. They couldn't give me brothers and sisters because my mom had me too late in life. And so it was really nice being adopted into the Greek family and feeling loved by them. And I'm going to tell you that I started using at about age 13, and I don't think I skipped too many days using until I got clean. I used daily almost right away, and I had a couple of bad episodes in junior high school where I took some of my mother's medicine out of the medicine cabinet and had an allergic reaction, and that was a bad enough experience that I told myself I would only smoke pot and drink alcohol from then on, because I didn't like what happened when I did those pills. I actually had to spend a night in the hospital, and that was pretty upsetting to me, and so that probably kept my addiction from progressing until I started using harder. And I had several incidents right in a row that left me in a lot of pain. The first one was the Greek family moved away rather abruptly, And I mean, it was fast too. George mentioned it casually. We're moving to Florida in a couple of months, but you know, we'll keep in touch and I'll be seeing you. And I thought he had some fantasy in his mind because nobody else mentioned it in the family. It turned out he hadn't even told his little brother, you know, and the family thought the little brother was too young to be bothered with it, so they didn't tell him until like a couple of days before they were moving. It was just really crazy because I had never imagined my life without them. I mean, we used to sit and talk about what our lives would be like when we got old and said, yeah, maybe we'll have houses next door to each other then too, and we'll watch our grandchildren play in the yard together, and painted these little pictures of what our future might be like, and the future that we painted had never been that we would separate. I guess we always thought we would be very close, and we weren't. It's difficult to keep that closeness behind separation. And I did see him from time to time after that, but the closeness was not there. And, you know, we moved on with our lives. Behind that, I fell in love for the first time and was not prepared at all for it not working out. I had this fantasy that the first time I loved somebody, he would love me too, and we would marry and live happily ever after. And I was so shocked when it didn't work out that way, and I really had a lot of trouble accepting it. And I compared every man I went out with to him for several years, and the only one that came close to measuring up was a guy that came along just behind the first love not working out, and I was still so frazzled from that incident that, you know, he expressed a desire and more with me, and I told him that I needed a cooling out period, and that I really liked him and wanted to be his friend, but I couldn't be romantic right now. And he said, okay. And, you know, initially I thought, oh, he's such a cool guy, I'll never hear from him again. But not only did I hear from him, he called me or came and picked me up almost every day for 2 years. And he was an unusual guy. He had a degree in psychology, but he chose to not work in the field. He did yard work, and he helped his parents at their bicycle shop, and he traded commodities, and then he helped people in his spare time. It was like his hobby, you know, and I was one of the people that he was choosing to help. And it was kind of neat because I really grew a lot during that time period, and then right when I was starting to feel really alive again, he got killed in an automobile accident. And I started feeling a little forsaken by God, because I felt like, wow, every time I love somebody, it seems as though they're taken from me. And, you know, and I was wanting to stop using already, but I didn't seem to know how, and I was already using against my will. And the thing with my friend Donald that got killed, him dying, it really rocked my world, because I believe he was killed as a result of this disease. I don't know that he was loaded, but I heard rumors from my dad talked to the state trooper that was supposedly following him, and he was flying, and he was in a small foreign car and going about 90 according to the state trooper, and they crashed into another car that was sitting still in the middle of the road, and the people in the other car had a pound of pot in the front seat of their car. So, you know, it was like two trashed people out on the road that shouldn't have been driving, is what it sounds like happened. And that made me think a lot about my lifestyle and what was going on with me, because I thought, what a waste of a human life that was. And it was real sad for me losing him. And I went to the pastor of my church, and thank you. And he gave me a book to read, and the book helped me with my loss. And the book also made me think about the idea of us as spirit. And it occurred to me that if that were true, if what I had read in the book were true, that it was possible that if I prayed regularly for some contact from Donald's spirit, I might get some. And I just really wanted to know that he was okay. And so I prayed regularly for a while, and I did have what I thought was some contact in a dream. And I felt satisfied, you know, and it was real brief, and he just said, I just wanted to let you know I was okay, and thanks for checking on my mom, and you'll see me again. And I thought, good, that feels good, because I just wanted to know that he was okay. And one of the reasons I wanted to know he was okay was one of my friends tried to tell me that he went to hell because he was using when he died. And I didn't like hearing that. And and I know that this is not a religious program, and I don't mean to get religious terms going on in here, but that was just what was said to me, and it bothered me a lot. So one night, about a year after Donald had passed away, I was hurting pretty bad, and I'd stayed up all night tossing and turning, and it was about 6 o'clock in the morning, and my muscles were really tense from tossing and turning all night, and I said, God, I'm really in a lot of pain, and if you would just let me talk to Donald, I know I'd feel better, you know, because I'm really lost and I don't know what direction to turn in. And no sooner had I said that silent prayer than a flash of light came in through the window. It went through my body and went out the other window. And a message came through the light. And the message was, stop using drugs, stop hanging out with people who are using drugs, and help others. And it was a big wow, you know, because I was left tingling and glowing, really peaceful and serene, and was like that for several weeks. And, you know, I don't know what it was that happened to me. The best interpretation I've ever gotten was that I was administered to by an angel. And that's good enough for me. I don't need to know what it was exactly. But I tried telling a few of my friends about it, and they were skeptical. And so I decided not to tell anybody else about it. But one of the things that was sort of interesting was one of my friends saw me right after it happened, and I was so changed that he cried. And I didn't want anything. It was Christmas time, and my friends were asking me what I wanted for Christmas, and I felt so peaceful and so satisfied and so disinterested in the things in the world that I just said, I have everything I need. You know, I really don't need a thing, and I felt that way. And, you know, and that's one of the nice things about this retreat is I've been able to not focus on the things of the world here. You know, I purposefully didn't bring jewelry with the exception of my watch. You know, I purposefully didn't bring nice clothes because I wanted to just focus on the people that I met here and spiritual things, and I think that's really nice. So, you know, the really crazy thing was that I felt really lost a few weeks again behind that because I was lonely. You know, I went to the pastor of my church. He had never met anybody that had anything like that happen to them. He was interested, but he didn't know what to think about it. And I didn't fit in with my friends anymore. And I didn't really feel like I fit in anywhere. And I started using again. And not only did I start using, I had the craziest experiences in my life behind that. And a lot of the time behind that, I was using against my will. I wanted to stop, I wanted to change, but I didn't know where to go. I didn't know how to stop using. And, you know, I think that the thing that kind of saved me was I really never stopped praying, though, despite how insane my lifestyle got. I had this feeling that God had his eye on me, and there would be spiritual repercussions if I didn't eventually stop using. And I thought, you know, you asked for help and you got this message through a flash of light that came through your window, so you'd better pay attention. And so what happened was I got involved with, you know, a group of organized people, and we were moving products out of South Florida, and things got really crazy in a hurry. And before I knew it, I was running around with the worst people in town. All my friends were carrying guns, and it hit me one day. When I first started using, it was in the early 70s, and it was about peace and love. We were all looking for peace and love. It was not about money. It was not about property. You know, it was not about power and control and any of that, and that's what my life was becoming. And I wasn't having fun anymore, and nobody around me was having fun. And I knew I was getting sick, you know, and I could see that the people that were like 10 years older than I was were definitely sick. And one of the things that happened was I started praying for help because I was having trouble getting high, and I knew that the next course of action for me was IV drug use. I'd always told myself that I wasn't going to do that, and I had an incident where I decided I'd give it a try, and the girl that fixed me up, she almost gave me as much as she used. And I stopped her just before she did that and said, "Wait a minute, you've been doing this for a long time. Do you think it's a good idea for me to do as much as you're doing?" And she said, "Oh, you're right, I'll only give you half as much." And I said, "Okay." So she gave me half as much, and I went blind. And I asked her if my eyes were open, and she said, "Yeah, they're open all right." And I said, "Well, I can't see a damn thing." And, you know, and I'm nearsighted anyway, and can't see very good without my contacts or glasses, so not being able to see at all was not something I was looking forward to. So I decided it was a good time to have one of those prayers with God, and, you know, I made a deal with God and said, "God, if you'll restore my vision, I will never stick another needle in my arm." And my vision did come back in about 5 minutes, and I kept my deal with God because that shook me up. And I thought it was just possibly another indication that God didn't want me using drugs. And so I was really wanting to change, and I was praying regularly at that time period. The insanity was escalating. I was followed everywhere I went for about 13 days, which I found to be a pretty unnerving experience. And I finally called the pastor of my church and made an appointment. And they followed me to the church. The cop that followed me to the church waved at me. I looked over my shoulder right before I went into the church. He waved at me, and they didn't follow me anymore. And I thought, cool, because it was driving me crazy. But my friend Teddy called me up one afternoon, and he said, "You know, Jamose, I'm jonesing, and I need you to bring me something." And so I go over there, and even though I was around that kind of stuff all the time, I'd never seen anybody in actual withdrawal. And Teddy's wrapped up in a blanket on the couch. It's 95 degrees in Montgomery, Alabama, and he's shaking and sweating. And I said, "What's wrong with you, man? Have you got the flu or something?" And he said, "No, Jamose, I'm jonesing, I'm withdrawing." And I said, "Is this what happens to you when you stop using drugs?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "You should absolutely stop doing this. You know, if this is what happens to you, you know, have you thought about seeing your doctor?" You know, because I just thought, what a terrible thing that's happening to this guy. And so we sat there and talked for a few minutes, and I said, "This is really making you sick, isn't it?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "It's killing you, isn't it, Teddy?" And he said, "Yeah, it is." And as I got in my car and drove away from there, I had one of those moments of clarity, you know, because I had always compared myself to the people around me and said, if I don't prostitute, and I don't steal, and I don't rob drugstores, and I don't use IV drugs, then I won't be an addict, and I won't be like them. And I told myself that I was better than they were, and it hit me all of a sudden, you're not better than they are, you're actually worse, because you're participating in helping somebody else take their life. And I started praying harder for change then, because I knew once I made that realization, I had that moment of clarity, I knew that I couldn't stay on that course of action anymore, and I really wanted to change. I had kind of the final straw. I had a couple of male friends come by, all within about a week of each other, and they basically said the same thing. One of them said, you know, Jamese, you don't know what you're doing. You're running around with the worst people in town. It's just a matter of time before somebody shoots you and takes your drugs and your money. You know, somebody had already kicked in my back door, you know, and stolen something out of my apartment. And he said, you know, you don't know what you're doing. You need to get out of this. And you don't even have a gun, you know. And when he left, I thought, I wonder if I should buy a gun, you know. And then that thought just seemed sort of ridiculous because I knew I was wanting to change. And another friend came by and said almost the exact same thing. And these weren't the sort of guys that went out of their ways to help women or to help people in general. They were guys that looked out for number one. And so I was a little astonished when I heard almost the same thing repeated by the second guy. And he said something in addition to that, and he said, and you know what, Jamese, I've been to prison, and you're not going to like it at all. He said, and I also think that your mom and dad will spend every dime they've got trying to keep you out. And I thought, he's right. And then I pictured the hurt looks on my mother and father's faces, you know, as they bailed me out, and you know, I knew that it was just a matter of time before I got into some real trouble. And lo and behold, the same girl that fixed me up with that IV drug shot, she came by. Her parents had checked her into a treatment center. She had gotten clean and was going to meetings. And she came by one night, and it was one of those nights where I had spent my last $500. I had no food in the refrigerator. I had no money for rent. It wasn't looking good. And I was feeling pretty down, and she said, Jamese, I'm going to a Narcotics Anonymous meeting. You want to go? And her mother had told her, you know, I'd gone to see her when she was in the hospital, and her mother had told her to invite me to a meeting. She said, Jamese was your only friend that came to see you while you were in the hospital. Why don't you take her to a meeting, you know? And I was so glad to be invited to that meeting because, you know, initially, I had a good feeling when I walked into the room. The people there were smiling and seemed happy, and they were making plans for the weekend to do stuff with their friends, and there was a feeling of unity. And I decided I wanted to stay clean and give the thing a chance. And I didn't use for a few days. Then I used. Then my car broke down, and I had to figure out how to get back to the next meeting. And it was about 3 miles, and I decided I'd walk to the meeting. And the other members gave me a meeting schedule then and gave me their phone numbers. I think they thought maybe I was ready since I had walked to the meeting. And I discovered that there was more than one meeting a week. I was in such a fog that first meeting that I didn't realize that I had other meeting options. And I'll tell you how much of a fog I was in when they held up the chips and said, these will help you stay clean. I didn't understand that it was a symbol. I thought that they literally meant that if I took one of those things, it would help me stay clean, and I thought these people have done entirely too much dope. If they think that little piece of plastic is going to stop me from using drugs if I want to, you know. But, you know, early recovery was a real adventure. It was the early 80s, and people were starting areas in regions, and I got involved with a service junkie before I'd even heard that wasn't such a good idea to get involved in a relationship initially. Not that it would have really mattered if I had heard it, because I'm sure I would have done what I wanted to do anyway. But I got involved with this guy, and what that did, even though the relationship wasn't very good, was it got me around a lot of other recovering people. It gave me an idea of how big this NA thing actually was. And I struggled initially the first few months. I had trouble putting together any clean time. I'd stay clean for about 30 days, and then I would pick up. And then I'd stay clean for about 30 days, and then I would pick up. And I always came back almost right away, but I had a lot of trouble surrendering. And I went to the World Convention in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, with a group of people from Alabama. And something happened there. I think that sometimes we underestimate the power of hugs and of large groups of people in our healing, but I believe that there is a power that we get from being touched and hugged and told that we're going to be okay. And I was a newcomer there, and I got a lot of support. And I left there realizing that if I stayed clean, that eventually, the way NA was growing, I would be able to go to any major city and a lot of minor cities and make an NA meeting. And I'd be able to see people a lot like myself there. And it kind of made me feel a little safer in the world of NA. And I committed to staying clean at that convention. And I enjoyed a couple of years of recovery. I did have a relapse. It was very difficult from time to time during the relapse. I'm not going to go a whole lot into that, but a lot of stuff went wrong at once, and I don't think I had the resources to work through it at that time. I guess my program wasn't quite solid enough. I also had a little reservation because I had this crazy thing in my mind, because once again I was in a room full of IV drug users and I hadn't been one. And I compared myself out a little bit too, because one of the things that was a problem was my perception anyway, was that even though some of them were clean, they were still behaving in a really sick fashion. And I thought, maybe I don't belong here, because I didn't feel like I was as sick as they were. And what I learned during my relapse was that it wasn't what or how much I used. I cannot use drugs successfully. No matter how I tried to use them, it was never successful. I tried all different kinds of experiments. I'll only use drug A, or I'll only use drug A Monday through Friday and drug B on the weekend. None of those little experiments I tried worked. And in the end, I concluded that if I wanted to have any sort of life, I had to stop using. And I had a lot of prayer and meditation about that before I surrendered. And when I surrendered, I surrendered. And I was living in Baltimore, Maryland at the time. I failed to mention that I married during my relapse. I thought I was marrying a normal man. I had it in my mind that I didn't want to marry a recovering addict because that first relationship had been a real headache. And so I thought, I'm going to marry a normal man when it was time for me to marry him. So I met this guy. He was the executive chef at this restaurant I was working at, and he looked like Mr. Normal, you know? I mean, he had the college degree, and then he had a technical degree, and he was just Mr. Smart and Mr. Working kind of guy. And I just thought, God has blessed me with this normal man, but what I didn't realize was that he was a workaholic, and what I'd done was I had unconsciously found somebody to emotionally abandon me again. I hardly ever saw that guy, and I was married to him for 10 years. I mean, it was still like we were dating after 10 years of marriage, when the marriage finally disintegrated, because the longer I stayed clean, the more confident I became about verbalizing what I wanted in the relationship. You know, and I would tell him what I wanted, and he couldn't give it to me. And I started becoming more and more dissatisfied, but he kept telling me that it wasn't like that forever. Once he made it in business successfully, then he would relax and we would have some time together. And it turned out, you know, one of those little twists and turns that life takes, his disease took another route. He got under pressure at work, started using, and staying out later and later. And I knew that something had to give, because, you know, here I am now, doing better than I ever have before. I'm feeling really confident. I'm making good grades in school. You know, I'd worked all the steps. I was feeling really peaceful and serene. And now my husband's staying out all night. And I thought, this is not the way it's supposed to happen. And, you know, and I couldn't understand why it was happening the way it was, because I felt like I was doing all the right stuff, and I started feeling like maybe I was being forsaken by God, because I really, I loved my ex-husband, and I couldn't believe that he was going to have to go through all the crap I went through to surrender. Even though he had seen what I had gone through, he was still going to put himself through it. But you know what? I realized too that I was really powerless over that. And one of the things I learned in early recovery is that I have to put my recovery first. And I knew the situation had to be resolved one way or the other in a hurry, because it was wearing me down in a hurry. I was hurting really bad. And I tried to get him into counseling, and it didn't work. And I invited him to meetings, and he wanted nothing of it. And he kept telling me that he didn't have a problem, that he was just having fun, that he was just partying, and what was wrong with that. And he was staying out later and later, and my recovery demanded that something happen. And so initially I tried to negotiate with him and said, okay, if you're having fun, you want to stay out, say you think you're going to be out till 11. You're still having fun at 11 and you want to stay out till 1. All I ask is that you give me a phone call and tell me you'll be out till 1, so I won't be worried. And he couldn't do that. And so after about the third time that he was out really late, I said, okay, honey, if you want to stay out all night, you can stay out all night, but you can't stay out all night and live here. And he couldn't believe that I said that to him. He saw himself, he was on this real power trip, and saw himself as Mr. Wonderful. He had all this stuff going for him. And I didn't, in his opinion. I was just a humble college student. And, it was sort of funny because even though it really hurt, I knew I was making the right decision for my recovery. Because, I really busted my butt those first few years to get my program the way it was. I went to a lot of meetings, I did a lot of step work, I did a lot of searching, I did a lot of counseling, and I thought, I'm not going to throw this away for anybody, no matter how much I love them. I hope that he makes recovery before we're divorced, but if he doesn't, that's going to have to be okay too. And I remember standing outside of my home group talking to one of the more experienced members one night after a meeting, telling him the way I wanted it to turn out, because I had this fantasy that maybe he would get recovery, he would hit bottom and seek recovery before we were divorced, and it would work out. And he, and I said, I don't know, maybe God has some kind of plan for me, I don't know, because my faith in God was a little shaken. And he said, Jamese, there's no maybe going on here. God most certainly has a plan for you, and it's better than any plan you could come up with yourself. And I held on to that idea because in the next few months, I had stuff happen that I couldn't have believed would all happen in a few months' time period. My mother came down with cancer and didn't last long at all, and I had to watch my mom die. And, and I'm just really grateful that I was clean, though, because I was able to be present for my mother. And there were times in my life when she was ill that because of my addiction, I wasn't able to be present for her. But she died knowing how much I loved her. I told her over and over again, and I read to her from some of her favorite books and held her hand and told her how precious she was. And I'm just glad that I had a good solid foundation and was able to walk through all that stuff. And I struggled, I struggled once again with that feeling of being abandoned by God. I thought that it was just possible that, this was like karmic stuff going on, and that maybe I had a whole lot of more crap that was going to go wrong. And to tell you the truth, quite a few more things did go wrong before things started going right. But I held on to the idea that God had a plan for me, and I'm really grateful that when I was expressing my inability to push on at one point to one of my friends who wasn't even a member in this fellowship, but was a friend of mine who was a counselor. He said something to me that stuck in my mind, because I told him, I said, I need a break from the pain. I feel like maybe I might need to use before I get through this. I don't know if I'm going to be able to walk through this without using. And he said to me, he said, Jamese, I want you to absolutely dismiss the idea of using from your mind. Because you know that there is nothing that using is going to do to help you solve any of your problems or help you walk through any of this stuff. And boy, did I need to hear that. And I knew I had to get back to the basics. And I did 90 and 90. And I shared and I cried in meetings, and sometimes I felt embarrassed about it because I felt like, wow, I've got a few 24 hours, I should be stronger, you know. But one of my home group members came up to me after the meeting one night and said, you're helping a lot of people by sharing about this stuff. And I said, why is that? You know, I said, I feel like such a baby for crying. And he said, Jamese, he said, because you're staying clean through it. He said, and the people in here need to know that they can stay clean through the difficulties like you're doing. And he said, you know, and I had to accept my humanness, you know. Having a few 24 hours doesn't make me a step below the angels. That was one of the things that I used to think when I first got clean that set me up for disappointment. If somebody had 9 or 10 years clean, I thought the angels were up here and they were right there. You know? And I thought that they should act in an angelic fashion all the time. And boy, was I disappointed when I would see them do something really screwed up. You know, I would think, this program doesn't work. And I failed to realize we're human. Not only are we human, we're recovering addicts, you know? So I've had to accept my humanness. I've had to accept that I'm not perfect, that, you know, every day isn't going to be a perfect spirit-filled day, you know? And that's okay, because that's not reality. You know, I wish that we could all work the steps and take this ramp up to spiritual peace and bliss and never have another difficult day, but it hasn't worked that way for me. And I don't know if that really exists on the earthly plane, but the basics saved me. You know, I did extra everything. I prayed 4 and 5 times a day sometimes, read spiritual literature 4 and 5 times a day. I wasn't able to do a whole lot else. I tried working and was crying on the job, and they really hated that and sent me home. And so my doctor basically didn't want me to work at that time, so I decided not to work. And I just toughed it out. And you know, I kind of had a shutdown period, and I realized now that what was going on was that I had really reached adaptive overload, and I just didn't have the resources to adapt to all the changes, because there were more that I'm going to go into, because time doesn't really permit for me to go into all the changes I went through the past few years. But I've had some interesting things happen in response to prayer during that time period. I was running out of money at one point, and prayed before I went to bed that night, said, God, I'm running out of money, help me out. And you know, went to sleep and woke up the next morning, went out to the mailbox, and my ex-husband had overpaid the mortgage, and the overpayment had come to my house. And so I had enough money for the next month. I was able to relax a little bit and not sweat it. And I know I had one night, one of my fantasies was that if I helped people, and did something really important to help somebody, that maybe God would bring my ex-husband into recovery. So I had this meeting to chair one night, and I was praying really hard, hoping to help someone. And I had this little chant going on before the meeting: God, let me help someone. God, let me help someone. Let me help someone. And so I do the meeting, and then this newcomer comes up to me and says she needs a ride home. And I said, okay, I'll give you a ride home. And so I gave her a ride home. And then I'm driving along, and my contacts were bothering me. So I noticed this man that was moving very slowly across the street, and I thought, I wonder if he's loaded. There's something disoriented going on here, and he didn't seem to be aware that traffic was moving toward him. He walked right in front of my car, and I stopped for him, looked in my rearview mirror just in time to see another car coming up on the left, and this guy fell across the hood of this other car. It tossed him up in the air. He did a flip and landed about 12 feet in front of my car. And I just went, holy shit. I mean, it was the damnedest thing I've ever seen. And I ran up to him, and he was alive and was moaning. And I thought, this was not what I wanted. You know, when I said, God, let me help someone, here I am, I'm the first person on the scene. And you know, and I thought, well, I took a first aid course, but that was about, 10 years ago. And so I proceeded to, treat this guy for shock, and other people came up, and they went and got ice, and we took care of him. And it was a kind of a nerve-wracking experience, but I told myself, you got to be calm, you got to be calm, you got to be here for this guy. And it was like, I'm not used to doing this first aid courses because I thought my friends were accident prone. It didn't occur to me that it had anything to do with our lifestyle, but we were all breaking our arms and legs and spraining our ankles and stuff. It was because we were loaded out of our minds, but I just thought, we're accident prone and I'd better take this first aid course. So anyway, this guy had this big thing on his head, and we just iced him down, and, didn't have anything to bandage him up with, so we just rubbed ice on every place that was bleeding. It was ridiculous. But the ambulance came eventually, and, they took care of him. There were these big African-American guys that had gone and gotten ice for me, and they came up to me and shook my hand when it was all over with and said, we were really glad you knew what to do because we didn't know what to do at all. And I said, I barely knew what to do. And they said, man, we just got off a plane from Detroit. And I said, welcome to Baltimore, and we all went our separate ways, and it was just bizarre. But I thought, I'm going to be so much more careful what I pray for and ask to help somebody in the room, No more people landing on the ground in front of the car, please. It was a little nerve-wracking, but, I think that one of the things that I had a little illusion about in my life was that it was supposed to be easy. I had this idea that eventually it was going to be easy. My ex-husband kept telling me that eventually it was going to be easier. And one of the things I'm realizing is that life is not really easy. Everybody in this room has been knocked down by life. And how do we keep picking ourselves up and dusting ourselves down and regaining our composure and pushing on? How do we survive adversity and come out whole on the other side? And, I've given it a lot of thought, and I really think that one of the things we have to do is learn to rely on the people around us that we love and trust and that love and trust us. And we have to also be able to leave matters that lie beyond human strength and understanding to God. Because things have happened to me that I know that I was just not wise enough to understand why they happened. And no amount of thinking about it was going to give me the answer. And I just had to trust that there was a reason, and I wasn't wise enough to know what it was. There's these big trees out in California, giant sequoia trees. And ordinarily trees, the roots grow deep into the ground, but this giant sequoia trees, their roots are shallow. They only grow together in groves, but their roots intertwine, and when the hard winds blow, they hold each other up. And in a sense, we need to be like giant sequoia trees and hold each other up during our difficult times. Nobody saves himself by himself. We're either saved by others or by God. That's who I choose to call my higher power, God. I think that one of the things that bothers me a lot is that I struggle every year around anniversary time. I think about how am I doing, what have I accomplished this year, and it never feels like enough. I'm my own worst critic, and no matter what I've done, it doesn't seem like enough. And sometimes my character defects will still bug me, things that I don't feel like I've overcome, and I have to remind myself that God isn't finished with me yet. I've come a long ways in the past few years, and one of the things that I think is interesting about humans is that our cells turn over every 7 years. Every cell in your body turns over every 7 years. So, that's symbolic of our spiritual, emotional, and intellectual growth. We keep changing and growing, and that's really important because that's the way life is. It's a changing, growing thing. And I have to realize that, that this is an evolution for me, and I have grown a lot, and I've got a lot more growing to do. I'm a good stretch off from being self-satisfied. But when I look back on where I was a few years ago, in those dark hours when my mother had passed away and my marriage had ended, and I didn't feel like going on, I'm so grateful that I kept telling myself, you just got to push on, Jamese. And I tell myself little things like, you came from strong people, your grandparents on both sides of your family were strong people, and they pushed on despite a lot of adversity and difficulties that were much more than you can imagine, so you can walk through this stuff. And I just tell myself I had to soldier on, and I'm really grateful I did, and did so without using, because today I have incredible love in my home. My life is a lot better than it's ever been before. I'm starting to feel, really confident and able to meet whatever challenges lie ahead of me again, and feel like I've got a lot to give. And I've got a lot to be grateful for. This program has given me so much, and I'm so grateful that I had a good solid foundation in my program and a commitment to staying clean through all that stuff. Otherwise, I'd be missing out on my bright future. That's what I'm hoping for anyway. Thanks for letting me share. I'll keep coming back.